it's a couple moments I got on the phone with her.
Yeah.
I'm like, babe, hey, damn, you want number one or number two or?
But
she's like,
would you agree?
You take care of that. You're a man. You figure out what we're going to eat tonight.
All right. Let's move past that. Would you agree that you've had too much to drink to drive?
I mean, I couldn't focus.
You say you want a revolution. Well, we all want to change the world. You tell me that it's evolution. Well, we all want to change the world. When you talk about destruction, don't you know that you can count me out? And it's gonna be.
Community policing has emerged as the unquestioned solution to the largely unexplored problem of why police services in the United States of America are terrible, or at least hated and resented by a huge percentage of the population. If not terrible, at least hated and resented by a huge percentage of the population. Community policing is presumed to mean fewer police at a lower cost, delivering a better result with lower crime, miraculously better outcomes. And in this strange, unexamined sense, community suggests that the police are less like a professional service, less like a branch of the military, you might say, and that they're your friends and neighbors. They're people from the community, whatever that means. On this deep, unexamined level, people just want to assume members of your own community are wonderful people. They're not corrupt. They're not bullying. They're not violent. They're not oppressive. People from other communities are corrupt and bullying and violent and oppressive. If we have local community policing, that would supposedly be some kind of wonderful improvement.
The Black Lives Matter organization is calling for a national defunding of the police, but the specifics look different in every city. For example, Black Lives Matter LA has proposed a budget that would cut police funding from more than 50% of the total city budget to just under 6%.
And somehow, whatever's wrong with policing in the United States of America, it's not that it could be improved by having more professionalism, higher standards of professionalism. No. The solution proposed by community policing is to have more amateurs, to have less professionalism, to have more volunteerism, you might say, which is a grand American tradition going back to the Revolution. No one seems to be cognizant of the irony that what killed Ahmaud Arbery was not highly professional police services. It was volunteer, amateur community policing, also known as vigilantism, right? It was two members of his community who stopped him because they saw him entering and exiting a building that was under construction. They suspected he was going to steal something, and he exited and so on. They stopped him to make a citizen's arrest. These are members of the community, right? And they're the type of men who I think, in my subjective opinion, the two men who shot and killed Ahmaud Arbery, I think they're not fit to serve. I think they're not qualified. I think they don't have the intelligence, they don't have the education. That's just my opinion. I'll be honest with you. The first time I saw a photograph of the faces of the two white men who shot and killed Ahmaud Arbery, I laughed out loud. Because to me, from my prejudiced, highly educated perspective, they looked like dumb, ignorant rednecks. And I thought that just looking at a photograph of their faces. Can we stop and reflect on how unfair that is of me? I just don't seem to share the reckless optimism of members of Black Lives Matter that if we take the power away from highly professional police services and hand it over to amateurs and volunteers in the community, that somehow that'll mean a wonderful improvement. I think, on the contrary, the slayings that have led up to the protests of 2020 really serve to teach us the opposite lesson. And paradoxically, as I'm about to show in a few clips, what happened in the United States of America when one small town in New Jersey, Camden, New Jersey, population 75,000, when they got on this ideological train of defunding the police, abolishing the police, what actually happened wasn't that they created a new police service that had lower costs and was closer to the community, had fewer police in the street. On the contrary, listen for it carefully. What we're told is they had 3 times as many cops in the street, and while they changed the name of their police department, if you just look at the uniforms these guys are wearing, the fact that every single one of them has a gun on his or her hip, it's obvious that the reality of policing in Camden, New Jersey has remained profoundly the same.
Another way a city could execute sweeping overhauls in law enforcement is to disband its police force and rebuild it from scratch. This strategy is rare, but there are a few examples. Camden, New Jersey took this approach in 2012 after crime levels hit record highs.
7 years ago, Camden County, New Jersey had some of the highest crime rates in the nation, and leaders say public trust in police was almost zero.
So something had to change.
That's when County Director Louis Capelli Jr. and others decided to start over, to rebuild their police department from the ground up, with mostly new officers, new policies and training, and a focus on community.
We now have 3 times as many officers on the street, 3 times as many officers on the street.
3 times as many officers on the street.
Let's talk more about growing support in Minneapolis for dismantling the city's police department following the death of George Floyd. This idea is not a new one. It's already happened in New Jersey. Back in 2013, Camden did just that with a renewed focus on community service.
Some Camden residents fear the good press has gotten ahead of itself. Longtime activists Pastor Amir Khan and Kevin Benson say when they disbanded the city police and replaced it with county cops, the police force became more white.
The Camden City Police Department had what the Camden County Police Department has now. It would have been just as successful, and you wouldn't have had most of the individuals coming from the outside. Camden City Police Force was a lot of community people. It was black and brown. It was people who looked like me. But now what you have is a new police force, which is majority white.
There's a lot of resentment about the police being taken over. The residents did not want that.
The only question is, will the same system that works for a community of 75,000 people work in Minneapolis?
Nearly a week after 9 members of the Minneapolis City Council made a drastic pledge to take apart the police department, the council took its first steps on Friday in a slow, complicated process that could eventually lead to shifting funds from the city police. But that process will last for more than a year and will require voters to actually approve of removing the police department from the city's core departments. Patrisse Cullors, co-founder of the Black Lives Matter movement, said defunding the police means reallocating those funds to support people and services in marginalized communities. Defunding law enforcement, quote, means that we are reducing the ability for law enforcement to have resources that harm our communities, close quote. Keep in mind, 3 times as many police on the streets.
3 times as many officers on the street.
3 times as many police on the streets. Cullors said in an interview with WBUR, Boston's public radio station, quote, it's about reinvesting those dollars into black communities that have been deeply divested from. Those dollars can be put back into social services for mental health, domestic violence, and homelessness, among others. Police are often the first responders to all 3, she said. If we're going to question who is and who is not qualified in our society to be a police officer, and we should, profound and difficult set of questions that don't lead to some easy one-word answer like community. The solution to America's policing problems is not community policing. How could it be? Shouldn't we also be questioning who would be qualified to engage in this kind of research and analysis? Who would be qualified to really guide a process of reform for how policing is done in the United States of America? I think that Patrisse Cullors, co-founder of Black Lives Matter, is in no way qualified for this tremendously difficult task. Colors was born in Los Angeles, California. She grew up in a low-income neighborhood in the San Fernando Valley. She became an activist early in life, joining the Bus Riders Union as a teenager. She later earned a degree in religion and philosophy from UCLA. Pardon me, her degree was in religious studies, not philosophy. She teaches at Otis College of Art and Design in the Public Practice program. She also teaches the Master's of Arts in Social Justice and Community Organizing at Prescott College. In an interview, Colors has described herself and Alicia Garza as, quote, trained Marxists, close quote. In the 21st century, it's very easy to find quite a lot of high-quality information about the university program she is a product of. Just a few years ago, by the way, she was a mature student, shall we say, at UCLA getting her bachelor's degree in religious studies. You can get the full list of courses, and you can indeed pause to reflect on how poorly a UCLA degree in religious studies would prepare you to guide the nation in reforming its police services.
Black Lives Matter LA has proposed a budget that would cut police funding from more than 50% of the total city budget to just under 6%. Finally, the most radical plan for police reform involves abolishing the police altogether. Similar to the defunding approach, most of the activists in this camp are in favor of strengthening social and community services in place of law enforcement.
Can you think of other majors you could have studied at university that would prepare you to play this role? Can you think of other types of research you might have done? Could you even think of some processes like having elections or voting on specific propositions and referendums? Do you think there's a way the public could be led to examining the different options that would be better than this woman emerging as the leader associated with a catchphrase, Black Lives Matter? Ultimately, that's all this is. This woman who's emerged because her name is attached to this catchphrase, her being treated as the expert on how, precisely how, now the United States of America should restructure its police services.
While other cities boiled over, here, the police chief marched with the protesters.
Our officers are guardians, they're not warriors. And
Camden County Freeholder Director Louis Capelli says the relative harmony between police and community is a result of Camden taking a radical step 7 years ago, disbanding its city police, tearing up union contracts, and replacing the department with a larger county police force more focused on neighborhood patrol.
The city laid off its entire staff, overhauled training to emphasize community policing, and rehired about 40% of officers.
I heard two historians talking just a few weeks ago about the history of the Haitian Revolution. This was the revolution in Haiti that rose up to abolish slavery and then thereafter had to fight against the armies of Napoleon for their independence. And one historian said to the other, well, isn't it true that while this revolution is described as a success, the slaves rose up, they murdered the white slave owners, they established a new republic, a new political system. Isn't it true, on the other hand, that this story begins with these men and women living in slavery, being compelled to labor on farms, and it ends with them being compelled to labor on exactly the same farms that before they had a kind of tyrannical dictatorial regime, and now they just have a different tyrannical dictatorial regime, and they're stuck in these farms. Isn't there a sense in which really the revolution is much less successful than we pretend it to be when viewed in these terms? And the other historian replied, well, no. You're presuming that the purpose of the revolution is just to change the form of government, if you will. And no, what really matters here is that the particular people who were in charge were eliminated by the revolution. To be blunt, they were massacred in this case. What really matters is not the question of whether or not they work on farms or whether or not there are democratic elections or what have you. What really matters is that the revolution accomplished the change in the particular people who were in authority. These slaves, although they were in a condition kind of 80% the same as slavery after the revolution, working on the same farms in the same conditions, and in worse poverty, because the revolution completely destroyed the economy, so poverty got dramatically worse, by the way. However, they had risen up and they had eliminated the people who formerly literally kept them in chains, literally whipped them, branded them, tortured them, publicly executed them in horrifying and humiliating kind of ceremonies. They had eliminated the particular generation of people, the particular generation of landowners and slave owners who had been oppressing them before. Are you just trying to change the particular people who happen to be police, or are you trying to fundamentally change policing? I think we can look back at the short film clips I've just shown you of this supposedly transformed police force in Camden, New Jersey, and we can all agree these are still police who very much dress and act like military men. It's really a military uniform they're wearing. They have a gun on their hips at all times. In no sense is the role of the police officer transformed by this process of quote-unquote abolishing the police. They quote-unquote abolished the police department, meaning that on paper, the name of the police department was rubbed out and a new name for a new police department was written in. What they did succeed in changing, apparently, they fired all of the police and then hired back about 40% of them. So maybe 60% of the police lost their jobs and didn't get them back. So there were some particular people who were changed. The other thing, mentioned there ever so briefly, they tripled the number of police in the streets. So if you think policing is oppressive, then this new model of community policing is more oppressive. Contrary to the promise quoted from Black Lives Matter in Los Angeles, who were talking about a dramatic decrease in the budgets for policing, we're talking about a dramatic increase in the budgets for policing. Black Lives Matter representatives, who are sometimes just people like myself on the internet, talking on a camera, who aren't particularly appointed, but they like to say that mental health professionals should be having many of these encounters, should be reaching out to people instead of police officers. Do you think psychiatrists work cheap? Do you think you'll have a smaller budget to have psychiatrists available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week? Do you think that psychiatrists are morally pure people in some sense that police are not, in some sense that your fellow community members are not? What is the assumption? That psychiatrists are good and upstanding people? I'll tell you something. If I bumped into an old friend from high school, someone I hadn't seen for 20 years, and he told me that he had become a police officer, and he was working as a police officer right now, my opinion of him would increase. My opinion of the type of person he is ethically, I would just think, I would think he was a good person, or I would think he was a better person than I had assumed previously from my memory of him 20 years earlier. If I bump into the same friend from high school who I haven't seen for 20 years, and he told me that he's become a psychiatrist, he's become a biopsychiatrist, he's someone who hands out prescriptions for antidepressants and so on and so forth, he's someone who maybe gives people electroshock therapy or talks them through their memories and this sort of thing, my opinion of him would be worse. I would regard him with more suspicion, more hostility, more distrust. Just being honest with you guys. All right? I do not think anyone who studied the history of psychiatry just in the last 50 years, in many ways, it's a terrifying profession full of terrifying people. And giving them a gun and a badge and putting them on 24-hour service, I can actually imagine a lot of ways in which that would go horribly wrong. There's no real reason to assume that psychiatrists are wonderful, compassionate people. There's no reason to assume that members of your own community are wonderful, compassionate people, whereas hiring someone from the next town 30 miles away or 100 miles away would somehow result in a much worse police force. There could be wonderful, compassionate people in the next town too. There were a lot of really strange, self-evidently nonsensical assumptions bundled up in this call for police reform and community policing. People want something better, but they can't even articulate what that is. And people like the leaders of Black Lives Matter, with a BA in religious studies from UCLA, they can't even engage in the analysis of precisely what is wrong with the system you've already got.
Dun, 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 dun.